now I'm going to try to separate gender identity with gender dysphoria, which are these two. One's a clinical diagnosis and the other's faith, and these have been intertwined and have been glued together by this treatment called gender-affirming care. Josh Marcy and Jack Turban are major proponents of gender-affirming care. Both Joshua and Jack Turban are sure that a child that just expresses a transgender identity is a transgender child. But where did they obtain their underlying evidence? As Jack previously stated, their primary source of proof is the Dutch study. What about the Dutch study? What questions can be raised regarding its legitimacy? Let us go to a court hearing in Florida over gender-affirming care, which was provoked by the Dutch and other Scandinavian countries discontinuing the use of puberty blockers.
The Dutch protocol was deemed a success because the youth continued to function well after surgery. This affirmative model of care has spread wildly in the last 8 years. The Dutch protocol is the foundation youth transition was built on. It is flawed. It is based on weak evidence. These are some of the problems with the Dutch study. Many concerns have been raised about its methodology. It was a case series, a small cohort of 55 teenagers. There was no control group. The follow-up period was only 18 months. This short period should be of concern. And most importantly, there has been no long-term data reported on these 55. The Dutch have been asked for their long-term data. In a June New York Times article, Dr. De Vries, the lead author, said the Dutch has lost contact with 50% of their early cohort. Dr. De Vries was interviewed on an American podcast in January. She made it clear that their patients' lives are much more complicated than the original study's outcome suggests. The Dutch, to their credit, were concerned about false transitions that would later be regretted. False transitions would be the worst possible outcome. Today, we call that regret and detransition. The Dutch had inclusion and exclusion criteria, hoping to limit false transitions. I want to emphasize two of these criteria. Early onset gender dysphoria was a requirement for transition. Early onset was described by the Dutch in one paper as gender dysphoria, quote, from toddlerhood.
Let's take a look at this excerpt from the WPATH conference that demonstrates the alternative reality that gender affirmative care operates.
Explore transgender health in a compassionate, sensitive way. Wondering if there's something available for transgender health. Anyone?
There's sort of a conglomeration of various things that people are pulling together, and there are some of us who are working on trying to develop some things like that, but really there's nothing out there that has been well researched and validated and normed and all that kind of stuff. It's pretty hard to do. What we do is use a lot of clinical wisdom on that. And there isn't, the other thing to know is that, you know, we're talking about gender dysphoria and this body alignment and that kind of stuff. We have no tools that can evaluate somebody's identity. We can get their ACEs scores, sure. We have a tool for that, and often trauma is a big part of people's experience. So we want to look at some of these other factors that are going on. The problem is a lot of those are gender normed. And so trying to figure out how to use those tools has also been really tough. And so, you know, I would say the answer is no.
There have been a few people who have developed translations,
yeah,
I think, and in different scales, but nothing, as you say, Sean, nothing has been normed and agreed by the professions that this is a useful tool.
Yeah, there's a minority stress scale that was developed that's good for the trans community, but it's for adults. So then again, it hasn't been translated for kids, but there are a few things out there that have been used that I think are really good in that frame. So it's very individualized, and it's not actually about how do we assess where somebody needs to go on their gender journey. That's more of overall treatment planning and health evaluation. So.
And like Sean said, this isn't something that happens overnight, you know, and unfortunately, because of all the politicalization and everything going on, you know, there's this sort of fear thing that's been created, like, oh, somebody's going to read a magazine article and suddenly they're going to say, oh, I'm trans and I need all the surgeries and I need the hormones and and it just doesn't happen that way, especially with younger people. There's always been an extensive recommendation for multi-specialty teams of specialists, working with the family, working with the younger person. You know, this goes on and on and on and on. I mean, these interventions and support are very intensive. And a lot of that just gets lost in this politicalization, really, that unfortunately is now behind sort of some of these questions and things that are out there.
Well, let's take a look at a case from a whistleblower who worked in one of these gender clinics. I am a 42-year-old St. Louis native, a queer woman, and politically to the left of Bernie Sanders. My worldview has deeply shaped my career. I have spent my professional life providing counseling to vulnerable populations, children in foster care, sexual minorities, the poor. I'm now married to a trans man, and together we are raising my 2 biological children from a previous marriage and 3 foster children. We hope to adopt. All that led me to a job in 2018 as a case manager at the Washington University Transgender at St. How little patients understood what they were getting into was illustrated by a call we received at the center in 2020 from a 17-year-old biological female patient who was on testosterone. She said she was bleeding from the vagina. In less than an hour, she had soaked through an extra heavy pad, her jeans, and a towel she had wrapped around her waist. The nurse at the center told her to go to the emergency room right away. We found out later this girl had had intercourse, and because testosterone thins the vaginal tissues, her vaginal canal had ripped open. She had to be sedated and given surgery to repair the damage. She wasn't the only vaginal laceration case we heard about. Other girls were disturbed by the effects of testosterone on their clitoris, which enlarges and grows into what looks like a microphallus or a tiny penis. I counseled one patient whose enlarged clitoris now extended below her vulva, and it chafed and rubbed painfully in her jeans. I advised her to get the kind of compression undergarments worn by biological men who dress to pass as female. At the end of the call, I thought to myself, wow, we hurt this kid.
And I just think, you know, we just need to remember access to gender-affirming care is suicide prevention, period. We know, we've had this for over 50 years, looking at the studies of youth in Europe, in the United States, gender clinics, as well as adults, that when people have access to gender-affirming care, and it doesn't matter what that care looks like, that care can change. Like Sean said, some of these folks may not necessarily persist in their gender journey, but whatever that care looks like, that saves lives. And when people don't have access to care, that's when they're killing themselves. That's when they're participating in behaviors that are dangerous to themselves or harmful to themselves, and all the horrible health disparities that we see linked with gender diverse people.
And there had to be no active mental health issues. Mental health problems excluded a teenager from transition. The very patients the Dutch excluded, late onset, post-pubertal, gender dysphoric youth with comorbid mental health issues are now the majority of youth being transitioned. We are transitioning the very population the Dutch excluded because they feared harm.